Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute. And with me today, of course, is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. But also with us is Zachary Yost. And some of you may know Zachary from one of our previous and popular episodes of Radio Rothbard, where we talked about just how strong is China as a geopolitical power. And we're going to have Zach back now again because he wrote a lengthy paper for the John Quincy Adams Society on China and its ability to essentially conquer Taiwan. And is this something that's likely? And really, what are China's capabilities? And Zach is a freelance writer. He's a Mises U alum, and he is a fall 2021 Marcellus Policy Fellow with the John Quincy Adams Society. And so this is part of the work he's doing for them. And when I saw the paper, I found it pretty interesting. I liked the sources, and it's, as is so often the case with foreign policy, there's very little information that is communicated in most cases. There's a lot of posturing, a lot of discussion. The media, of course, never actually really talks about the history of these places or military capabilities in any sort of detail, except maybe to trot up a few Pentagon generals or something like that. And we know how reliable that testimony is. So a little bit more detailed scholarship, I think, is always helpful. And so I've got Zach and Tho to discuss this in a little bit more with me today. So Zach, Tho, how are you guys doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Thank you for joining us. I think it'll be pretty interesting. Now, I should note from the beginning that we're going to focus pretty much on what you write about here in the paper, and which is called, by the way, Victory Without Battle, a Smarter Vision for U.S.-Taiwan Policy. Again, this is a Marcellus policy analysis done for the John Quincy Adams Society, and I will link to that in the description. You can just have a look at it. And looking at this, I see that you were careful to say that look, there's a limit to what we're discussing in this paper. We're not going to cover whether or not Taiwan constitutes an essential national security issue for the U.S., but that's often just assumed in a lot of these discussions, and that's, of course, a topic that needs to be discussed. But I think the focus here is really to look at what are China's actual capabilities. And so if we're going to be talking about, this is something the U.S. should or should not be doing, maybe we should have a somewhat informed opinion about what are the actual capabilities of both of the U.S. and China, and really what does it mean to launch a humongous amphibious assault against a country like Taiwan. I think people have seen a lot of movies and they just assume this is some real easy thing to do. And anybody who's got a lot of troops can just easily pull it off. But the reality, of course, is much more complex than that. So, Zach, why don't you just kind of I went into that with just a summary, maybe already stepped on your toes a little bit there about what you're going to tell us. But why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of the origins of this and what you were trying to do with it?
Sure. So as lots of listeners are probably already familiar with, Taiwan and the U.S. relationship with China in general is becoming an increasingly prominent topic, not only in foreign policy circles, but just among the general public as well. And some of that started with Trump, and we see a continuation of this kind of increased hostility between the U.S. and China. And one of the linchpins in this situation is the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. So just for the listeners who don't know, Taiwan is not recognized by the United States as an independent country. It's a de facto independent country that the U.S. has had relations with since it came into existence, basically. But China, the People's Republic of China, claims that Taiwan is part of them and that it's a breakaway province. And the U.S. basically when it stopped recognizing Taiwan, Congress passed legislation saying that the U.S. Was going to continue to sell weapons to Taiwan of a defensive character to help it remain independent. We did not guarantee its independence or anything like that. And for decades, we've pursued a policy of strategic ambiguity, where our official policy is we don't know what we'd do if China invades, more or less. And there's a big push to change that right now in favor of strategic clarity, in favor of if China messes with Taiwan, the U.S. is going to storm in and crush China and rescue Taiwan and beat the commies. And so in this paper, I basically encourage people to take a step back and away from the general assumptions, which is, when you've got a giant hammer in the form of the U.S. military, everything looks like a nail. And so I'm like, we've identified this widely shared end of maintaining Taiwanese de facto independence. What are the best means to achieve that end? And in this paper, I argue that using the hammer of the U.S. military is not the best way to achieve that end. And in fact, that it would likely end in disaster. And so what can we do instead to basically avert this disaster, but still achieve the widely shared ends of basically the Washington foreign policy establishment and increasingly more and more of the public? Recent polling has shown for the first time a majority of Americans, a very small majority, but a majority nonetheless, say they're in favor of using the military to defend Taiwan if China invades. And for a variety of reasons, I say this would be a disaster. So let's look at how we can accomplish this end using other means.
Well, and of course, this is a long simmering issue, right, for our under 40 crowd or whatever, under whatever crowd. I can remember having this exact same discussion in 2001 in graduate school, right? The question was, will the U.S. really intervene if China attempts to invade and take over Taiwan? And back then it was just speculation like it is now because of, as you say, they were never really clear. And they never wanted to send a clear message on what would happen. And I can only guess that the public's view of it depends heavily on what they're told in the media and what the current party platforms are. And, you can drum up support, I think, for whatever you want if you try hard enough in many cases, although I guess that's getting less and less easy to do. So it does seem interesting that the Taiwan issue apparently is gaining favor among some people in the public. But we can assume that that's not because they considered all of the geopolitical evidence and tactical options available, and then just say, "Oh yes, I think this is a good option." And so maybe you could then just tell us what are some of the biggest factors that people should consider when they're looking at really the viability of U.S. intervention in Taiwan.
Sure. So the first factor that people really need to be aware of is what capabilities does the U.S. have to stop an invasion scenario? And I argue that our ability to actually stop this is very limited. And as you say, the public has probably not considered all of the details of what would be involved here. They just know the U.S. military is giant and powerful, so and we've also, for the past 30 years, have basically been bombing kind of very not advanced countries militarily into oblivion. China is a modern, very large, nuclear-armed power. And one of, in the history of warfare, there are kind of varying epochs where one period, generally, defensive technology will be predominant, and on the other, a different era, offensive technology will kind of have predominance. In our current era, defensive technology is predominant, and what this is called is anti-access area denial capabilities. And it's generally believed that China could likely sink any U.S. vessel within 500 miles of its coastline using missiles, submarines, drones, things like that. So this is obviously a concern because the U.S. is about 6,000 miles away from Taiwan, and Taiwan is 81 miles at its shortest point from mainland China. So it's very possible that the U.S. could send the Seventh Fleet storming into the Taiwan Strait and end up losing an aircraft carrier with 5,000 people on board, which is very hard for probably anyone who, was not an adult during perhaps the Korean or Vietnam War or even World War II to imagine losing 5,000 American lives in one day. The public would go insane, and it would almost inevitably lead to a pretty dramatic escalation between two nuclear-armed powers. What is also very concerning in this same vein of defensive technology that China would have is that most U.S. bases in the region are in Japan. And I cite a very interesting wargaming study that found that basically within the first day of the outbreak of a war, China would be able to obliterate all of our bases in Japan, potentially destroying a majority of our aircraft on the ground, sinking most of our fleet in Japan in port. It'd basically be a disaster. And even the kind of hawkish authors of the paper argue, well, we can put these missile defenses in Japan, and they're like, but still probably Okinawa would probably be overwhelmed. So and there are other reasons to believe that wouldn't be very effective. So, and the final point that listeners should be aware of is that the United States Navy is not really on the top of its game these days. Since the end of the Cold War, the Navy has not had a peer competitor. They've basically acted as a sea-based land attack platform for blowing stuff up in Iraq or Libya or other places in the Middle East, not fighting actual modern naval warfare. And there's a variety of reports that I cite that get this point across. Naval vessels are crashing into each other, crashing into other commercial vessels, and reports find that the crews are overworked, undertrained. An entire vessel was lost at port because a sailor started an arson fire and the crew was not properly trained. Flammable material was all over the place, and something around 80% of the fire suppression systems were not actively maintained and usable when the fire broke out. So a multi-million, potentially billion-dollar ship just burned up. And there are also other concerns. The U.S. Navy is currently at or over its repair capacity, and we're currently at peace, and has not had to actively repair battle damage from more than one vessel since, I believe, World War II. So we would be dealing with fighting a naval war with an unprepared Navy 6,000 miles away with a very defensively advantaged opponent and no realistic plan for repairing damaged vessels. So it's a complete disaster waiting to happen. So I'd say that's the first point that listeners should be aware of.
Just incredible. All the money spent on this military budget, and these are still the problems that we have. I mean, it's sickening.
Oh, yes. And there's a very interesting report published by some senators. I think Tom Cotton was one of the people who commissioned it, on the fighting culture of the U.S. Naval Surface Fleet. And the report was pretty concerning and basically saying that the Navy has turned into a giant floating bureaucracy because it's had nothing to do, really, for 30 years. They talk about any minor mistakes get people fired, so people are very risk averse, and kind of not willing to take responsibility for things like that. Now, the other thing that is a very common misconception among the public and also policymakers and commentators is that Taiwan is just a sitting duck. That without the US, Taiwan, like China could just invade Taiwan tomorrow, conquer the whole thing in a week, and that's it. The US is the only thing standing between Taiwan and communist tyranny. But Taiwan is not this sitting duck that people think it is. There are a variety of factors, and personally I find it fascinating as I learned about all these tiny details that, as you were saying, are never really discussed, that are kind of crucial points to understand about why invading Taiwan would probably be one of the most difficult military undertakings in history. Taiwan has prepared for about 70 years now for invasion from China. They have literally geoengineered the island so that there are about, I think it's 13 or 14 beaches on the whole island that are suitable for the kind of large-scale landings that would be necessary to conquer it. Their military, and we can discuss this in more detail later, but theoretically, they could field over 2 million troops if they called up their reserves and whatnot, and an additional million support personnel and things like that. And a crucial point, the Taiwan Strait is not suitable for invasion most of the year, and this is explicitly stated in Chinese military documents that basically there's a period in the spring for a few weeks and a period in the fall for a few weeks where the strait is calm enough to, transport 1 million troops across. And then the third point that I discuss is how China does not really have the resources necessary for this huge undertaking. And lots of commentary on China's powers, like, well, China spends $1 gajillion on their military budget and Taiwan only spends this much. They have 1 gajillion troops and Taiwan only has this many troops. They have this many ships, yada, yada, yada. And it's very true. China is the most populous country on earth and it's one of the largest. But with that size comes a lot of costs. About half of the Chinese military is employed full-time either defending China's 14,000-mile-long border that's contested, actively so in some places with many of its neighbors, or keeping order and suppressing dissent in their authoritarian society. So it's not as if China can just pick up all these spare troops they have lying around and all of their excess resources and attack Taiwan tomorrow. It'd be very clear that the invasion was coming, and it's questionable. I would argue they currently don't have the capacity to invade. That's another thing I'd like the listeners to understand. China cannot invade Taiwan tomorrow. If you take anything away from this, they can invade right now. They don't have the capacity, and we can discuss all the variety of reasons why. But those are kind of my three very large points that I then discuss details of as to why, what the situation is and why the U.S. should look for other ways of solving this problem other than, blowing everything up, or at least attempting to.
Yeah, I think a lot of the public's misconceptions about it just stem from their ideas of amphibious assault warfare, right? Where they saw a band of brothers and they figure, you just need to mass enough troops and you can overcome whatever the shore defenses are. But of course, that was 75 years ago. There weren't precision-guided missiles then, the ability to destroy ships from over the horizon as they get within dozens of miles. And and I think Michael Beckley makes this point, and I noticed, of course, in your research, you quote him on, he provides many of the details on just all of the problems that China faces logistically in terms of just amassing enough troops. But the realities of amphibious assault today are just so completely different from what they were 50, 60, and especially 75 years ago. And That's just really basically irrelevant now. And that's a pretty wide, that body of water between the mainland and Taiwan is not insignificant. I mean, it's not like it's not the English Channel.
It's not the English
right?
Channel, exactly.
And so the realities are very different. And I think also, and whenever I hear about this, there's a big discussion about, okay, could this happen, right? And I think you walk us through a lot of what are the problems that face China and what the U.S. maybe could conceivably have to do and the problems that the U.S. faces. And those are all tactical issues. And I don't know if you discussed this, but I'm always left wondering, what are the longer term strategic implications of it in that, so the U.S. turns Taiwan into an explicit U.S. protectorate. What does that mean? That basically, I guess, means Taiwan is like South Korea in some respects. And then what effect does that have on Chinese domestic policy, right? Because, of course, the U.S. role in South Korea has done wonders for fueling the perceived legitimacy of the North Korean regime, because that's just turned the U.S. into some great boogeyman that now the whole Juche ideology in North Korea is built upon this idea that these Americans are just there to oppress and destroy Korea. And you look across the DMZ from North Korea and says, yeah, look at all those Americans stationed there, and they're here to destroy our culture, and they just sit poised to destroy us here in North Korea. So it would seem that would be great for the Chinese regime to say, look, these Americans, they conquered part of us, and now they're just sitting there across the strait waiting to do something worse. And I don't see how that would help any efforts to delegitimize or to rein in Xi's regime up there. And
yes, exactly. I don't go into this very much, but yes, there are lots of proposals to station U.S. troops in Taiwan, which I would argue would be a disaster. And kind of touching on what you just said, I would argue that it would fuel more nationalism in China, because China is becoming more and more nationalist, and some of that is purposefully engineered by the government, of course. But I would argue that would put pressure on the Chinese government to do more. Currently, people freak out. They say, oh, China's flying planes into Taiwanese airspace. And what's actually happening is China is flying warplanes through Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, I believe it's called. So this area, I believe I've seen on some maps, it literally goes over part of mainland China and way down. So they're not buzzing Taipei or anything. They're still very far away. And these are called gray zone tactics. And I would argue these are actually a good thing in that they allow China to say, the Chinese government to say to the kind of agitating nationalist elements, look, we're doing something about Taiwan, when actually it's not really anything of significance. Were there U.S. troops there, the pressure to do something more, I would think, would be turned up a great deal and could potentially lead to dangerous escalation and even accidents and mistakes that could lead to something no one wants. And I would argue that the Chinese government worries much more about domestic issues than it does about foreign policy, and that the domestic issues in some sense drive foreign policy a great extent. And so, yes, it would not, I would argue it makes the chances for war greater if the U.S. has troops present in Taiwan rather than successfully deterring an invasion.
Yeah, this is something I often try to work into the discussion, is that the local domestic situation matters, right? If you're Iraq, you're Saddam Hussein, you have a lot of domestic concerns dealing with the Kurds, dealing with the Shia minority. These were all things he was probably a whole lot more worried about than making George H.W. Bush look bad. There were local problems there that you need to take into account when you're talking about how the U.S. should interact with country X, whatever it happens to be. And so, yes, I think the domestic situation in China, and we shouldn't always assume that the regime is less or is more bellicose than the general population, right? A lot of the time the regimes they're just interested in pandering to the public to hold on to power. But a lot of the time pandering the public constitutes being seen as more aggressive in terms of international affairs. And so I don't think that's something that we can ignore. But so do you, I mean, on local politics, I mean, do you think in terms of the U.S., right, do you think there's a disconnect here also in terms of, I mean, we can talk about the polling and how committed the public is to that. How do you think the public would actually really react if it was faced with the choice of, well, we got to send 20,000 troops on boats to the Taiwan Strait? Would the conservatives just be all down with that, or how would that play out?
Well, I do think that there is, I think reflected in the polling is kind of the acceptance that China is the threat that it was viewed as Middle Eastern terrorists for a while, right? Or kind of the big player on the world stage that is the international threat to America at home. I think, however, if you got this situation, it would be very similar to the way we're seeing it play out right now with the chaos at the Ukrainian-Russian border. Ultimately, it'd be what are the folks like someone like a Tucker Carlson on Fox News positioning on that issue? Where would some of these more America first non-interventionist types within Congress that are good at social media little blurbs, the Matt Gaetzes of the world that have been anti-intervention within Russia, where would they side on a China issue? Because some of these individuals that have been getting better on Iran than Republicans of the past, that have been better on war on terror generally, better on Russia. Some of that they view everything is pivoted to China as being the great threat. Steve Bannon has put China right in the forefront of the number one concerns, and so I think there would be, I think there'd be a lot more support than you would have in some of these other conflicts. But I think there still would be that strong the investments that have been made. I think the views taking that more isolationist sort of worldview. I think that is baked a little bit with much further into the mainstream right currently. But I think this is one of the most dangerous fronts out there. Just from there's been so much backlash kind of building, from the economic side, from the COVID side. If this is one where that war zone really would, I think, bring a lot of people into a more hawkish mode.
Yeah, I think although I've argued that China does not present the threat that many hawks portray it as, it's nevertheless, you can far more plausibly argue that China is a serious threat, whereas it's difficult to do that with Russia. I mean, Russia is so much smaller. Their economy is tiny. I mean, Russia really can't compare to Germany alone, let alone the United States. So China's a different issue. And as you say, though, right, in the U.S., we have different levels of hawks and doves, and some factions are more into it than others. And the same is true in Russia, as has been pointed out in recent days by some people who actually study Russia. But I don't know. Zach, you know more than me. It seems that the party's been centralized quite a bit in recent years under Xi. But are there still competing factions in terms of some people want to play nice with the U.S. and some are really gung-ho nationalist?
So I'm not really up on all the domestic inter-party squabblings. You're right. She has centralized a lot of power, and I have read some interesting things about some younger members of the party in some cities are like kind of driving a new wave of Maoism, practically, much more like we're communists and. Push it. They're attempting to push the government in a more hardline direction, I would say. I don't think too many people, to my knowledge, are saying we need to like play nice and restore our restoration with the United States. I've not seen that very much. That's for sure. I think it's kind of just to what extent how badly the relationship is going to degrade, I would say.
Well, before it all sounds like we're too one-sided on this, you also note in your paper some of the weaknesses that Taiwan faces. Right, because yes, they've been preparing for 70 years, but that all requires a lot of maintenance and ongoing effort. So, what are some of the weaknesses on the Taiwan side that we have to be careful of?
Right, and going back to your point of what could be an unintended consequence of the U.S. Deploying troops or providing kind of a stronger security guarantee to Taiwan, one of the largest issues is that Taiwan likes to free ride on the U.S. They have on paper a very large capacity. For a very long time, they had a draft, and on paper, they could call up 2 million troops and an additional million civil defense personnel and contractors and all kinds of stuff. So that's all great. But when you actually kind of look under the hood, things are quite a mess. And I cite this recent Wall Street Journal article that was kind of hilarious in a dark way, where they're like, young Taiwanese people will stuff themselves to get fat so they won't have to qualify for military service, which has been reduced from, I believe, 2 years to 4 months. And lots of people are like, yeah, I spent 4 months watching American war movies, raking leaves, and moving old tires around. So it's questionable exactly how effective the vast human wave that they anticipate having at their disposal would be. Additionally, a point of concern is their equipment acquisitions from the U.S. and what that says about their mindset and strategy. Currently, the Taiwanese strategy basically involves trying to, of course, destroy as much of a Chinese invasion fleet across the horizon before they get to Taiwan as possible. They'd be mining the strait. They'd be deploying their air force. Their navy would be sallying forth. They'd be attacking mainland China with missiles. And their basic strategy is try and destroy as much as possible before it lands on Taiwan. And they have many advantages in that there's not really going to be a surprise as to where the Chinese land. There's only so many beaches. Those beaches have been mapped out for decades. And, every path from that beach to Taipei and inland is mapped out with defenses and whatnot. And they're kind of the penultimate stroke of their strategy is that if the Chinese manage to secure a beachhead, which there's lots of reasons to be skeptical they could do that, basically on the morning of the second day of the invasion, Taiwan would just overwhelm the beach with basically a massive attack of armored tanks and just massed infantry. And this has been attacked as being not realistic by other writers. But I point out that there's reasons. Technology is changing so rapidly, and we've not really been fighting. No one's been fighting really modern warfare. We've been fighting, the U.S. certainly hasn't. We've been fighting, guerrilla warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, or just pounding the heck out of people who don't really have any air defenses. But if the listeners aren't aware, there was a brief war between Armenia and Azerbaijan last year. And one of the main takeaways from that war, where Armenia was kind of crushed, they were crushed in large part because all the Armenian armor was obliterated by Azerbaijani drones, which are very inexpensive. So it's questionable just how feasible the future of armor on the battlefield, and whether or not the Taiwanese military leadership is actually serious about confronting the realities of contemporary warfare, or if they're still stuck in this mindset where in previous decades the Taiwanese Navy and Air Force could do whatever the heck they wanted because China, even like until the early 90s, was not on par with them. That era is long past now. And part, I would argue, of what underlies this mindset is just an expectation that the United States will save the day. And I cite polling that backs that up. Over half the Taiwanese say, a lot of Taiwanese say if China invaded, they would fight to defend Taiwan. But they also say, but the United States and Japan will swoop in and the war will be over really fast. So it's questionable how prepared they are if the rubber hit the road.
Well, and I think that brings us then to the final issue here is it would seem that the worst case scenario for the planet would be something that escalates out of control. And I think a lot of the time people maybe underestimate the ability where a lack of information and misreading the other guy can lead to real escalations and even the use of nuclear weapons. Hopefully never strategic nuclear weapons. Maybe the use of some tactical ones seems to be more plausible, but you never know if someone panics enough. So it would seem that that's far worse.
And I don't think China, I could be wrong, but I don't think China actually has tactical nuclear weapons.
Oh, well, that seems like a bad thing.
Only the US and Russia, I believe, maintain a sizable amount of tactical nuclear weapons. China basically has a lot of ballistic missiles in silos in deep valleys, basically, that kind of, because of the trajectory needed to take out the Chinese nuclear silos is not really feasible. So they kind of have a guaranteed second strike capacity. And yeah, if nukes become involved, it'd be terrible. And there are people on the US side, I mean, these are the more extreme voices who say we should provide a nuclear guarantee. Like, we will use nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan, and which is just craziness. It's insanity. But there are people who say we should do that.
So it would seem that in attempt to, if a goal is to defend Taiwan from a Chinese takeover, that needs to be less than, that needs to be in the service of the goal of avoiding escalation. And so you discuss a little bit how we might proceed in order to not guarantee, but increase or rather decrease the odds of escalation out of control. And so what are some of the things that need to be done?
Right. So, and let me clarify for some of the more hardcore listeners that, I am suggesting the government do certain things, but I'm doing that because to me it is the most feasible way to accomplish the end of not going to nuclear war with China. And I argue that by doing basically two things that are, I would say, are low risk and low expense, the U.S. can bolster Taiwan's ability to deter a Chinese invasion while also keep the U.S., really reduce the chance of the U.S. being pulled into a war. So the first thing is for Congress to be more more thoughtful in approving arms sales to Taiwan. I think we should keep selling tons of weapons to Taiwan. But so for listeners who aren't aware, arms sales to foreign governments generally have to be approved by Congress. And Congress a lot of times rubber stamps these, especially to places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And Taiwan, we generally sell them mostly whatever they want, although we have said no to certain things at times. But it's questionable what advantage it gives Taiwan to sell them tons of advanced Abrams tanks, kind of for some of the reasons I discussed before. If these things are going to be reduced to smoking hulks within, a few hours of the start of hostilities, why are they doing that? Perhaps they should be investing in buying gajillions of naval mines and inexpensive drone swarms that are very survivable and inexpensive. The other thing I suggest is that the U.S. can help improve Taiwan's reserve force. So Taiwan has switched to an all-volunteer military, and recruitment hasn't been that great. So some things I suggest are basically providing incentives for people to join the Taiwanese military that don't cost us very much, but also give Taiwan more deterrence. So Taiwan has a junior ROTC program where people in high school basically do military drills, and then when they graduate, they can become officers and things like that. It would be not very expensive and not very dangerous to offer scholarships for those students to come and train in the U.S. or go to U.S. universities and things like that. So in a way, it's kind of bribing the Taiwanese to defend themselves, but it's better than U.S. troops being there and doing it instead. And similarly, if Taiwanese reserves could come and train in the U.S., it'd be like, get a trip to the U.S. and, visit Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon while you're here, improving your, ability to, fight a modern war. And there are also other things, just more broad discussion about realistic ways to reform the reserves that could take place. Basically, anything other than sending U.S. troops to Taiwan, because that would be extremely upsetting to the Chinese and could increase hostilities. So if the Taiwanese come to America, it serves as, one, an incentive for them to want to do it, and also keeps us out of Taiwan. And again, it'd be great if we didn't do any of this at all, but the reality of the situation is that the U.S. government is going to do something. So hopefully we can do something less destructive than what they would probably do by default anyway.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and let that be the last word on it. Again, thank you for listening, and we will link to this report in the video description if you're listening to this on YouTube, and I'll make sure we have a link to it on Mises.org if I haven't done that already, and we'll indicate somewhere how you can access this report at the site. So thank you very much for listening to Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week with another episode, and we'll see you next time.